Imagine this. The year is 1942. The world is engulfed in a cataclysmic war, and the skies over the Solomon Islands, a crucible of desperate naval and air combat, are a theater of unparalleled intensity. Here, amidst the chaos of battle, stands a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. A 19-year-old aerial gunner named Eddie Kowalski. He's stationed in the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress, a colossal four-engine bomber designed to deliver payloads of destruction deep into enemy territory. His hands, young and strong, grip the handles of a Browning M250 caliber machine gun, a formidable weapon that, even at rest, vibrates with latent power. As the B-17 bucks and weaves through the turbulent air, the gun pulses under his touch, a living extension of the aircraft's defensive capability. Suddenly, a chilling sight. A Japanese Zero fighter, the sleek, highly maneuverable pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, slides into Eddie's field of vision. It's perhaps 300 yards distant, a mere speck one moment, then a rapidly growing menace. The Zero is performing a crossing shot, moving from left to right across his field of fire, a dart aimed straight at the lumbering bomber formation. Every fiber of Eddie's being, every ounce of his training, every primal instinct for self-preservation screams one command: hit it. He aligns the crosshairs of his rudimentary iron sight directly on the enemy plane's fuselage, precisely where he can see it, and he squeezes the trigger. A thunderous roar erupts from the M2. 50 rounds, each a meticulously crafted projectile of lead and brass, shriek out, propelled by explosive force. Tracer fire, laced into the ammunition belts at regular intervals, arcs across the vast expanse of sky. These glowing projectiles are meant to guide the gunner's eye, to show him where his bullets are going. But what Eddie sees in that terrifying moment is not the satisfying flash of impacts, not the splintering of metal, not the sudden plume of smoke signifying a kill. Instead, he watches in horror as every single precious bullet streaks harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot, with an almost contemptuous indifference, doesn't even bother to take evasive action. The enemy fighter just continues its trajectory, sleek and utterly untouched, as Eddie's ammunition counter spins down, down, down toward empty. His heart pounds, a drumbeat of frustration and fear. The Zero is gone, having completed its pass, and Eddie is left with nothing but the echo of gunfire and the bitter taste of failure. Yet, this wasn't Eddie's failure alone. This agonizing, desperate scene, played out in countless variations, repeated itself thousands of times across every theater of World War II during those bewildering early years. American aerial gunners, men who were, by all accounts, exceptionally well-trained, fiercely motivated, and equipped with what many considered to be the finest heavy machine guns ever manufactured, were missing. Not occasional missing, they were missing constantly. This wasn't a problem of courage. It was a problem that baffled commanders, demoralized crews, and, most critically, led to staggering, unsustainable losses. To understand the scope of this devastating enigma, we must turn to the hard, unblinking eye of statistical analysis. In early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces initiated a comprehensive study, delving into the grim reality of aerial combat. They meticulously analyzed thousands of feet of gun camera footage, the silent black and white witnesses to countless engagements over both the battle-scarred skies of Europe and the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Pacific. The results, when finally tabulated and presented, were nothing short of catastrophic. They revealed a truth so brutal that it sent shockwaves through high command. trained aerial gunners were achieving hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. Let that number sink in. 4%. It meant that for every 100 rounds fired with such desperate hope at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner's position, the classic crossing shot, a staggering 96 bullets were hitting nothing but empty air. 96 bullets, expended with no effect, no damage, no deterrent. The implications were immediate and horrifying. The mathematics of this failure were stark and unforgiving. A typical engagement in those frantic seconds of aerial combat might last a mere 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter broke off its attack, moved out of range, or was engaged by another defender. The Browning M2, a magnificent weapon, fired at an impressive cyclic rate of roughly 800 rounds per minute, translating to approximately 13 rounds per second. In a 10-second engagement, an eternity under fire, yet a blink of an eye in terms of ballistics, a gunner could theoretically put 130 rounds into the air. But with that abysmal 4% hit rate, it meant that perhaps only 5 bullets, if any, might actually strike the target. And 5 hits, even from a powerful 50 caliber round, simply weren't enough. Not enough to reliably down a nimble, lightly armored Japanese Zero, whose pilots often fought to the last, and certainly not enough to cripple a rugged, heavily armored German fighter like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 Werger Shrike, a true brute of an aircraft designed to absorb punishment. These formidable German and Japanese fighters could often endure dozens of 50 caliber rounds, veritable torrents of lead, and yet keep flying, turning, and attacking, their pilots often returning to base with their planes looking like sieves, but still functional. The human cost of this unseen, unfathomable problem was staggering. In 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force, spearheading the Allied strategic bombing campaign over Europe, was hemorrhaging manpower and machines. They lost an average of 188 bombers per month. To put that into terrifying perspective, each B-17 Flying Fortress typically carried a crew of 10 men. This translates to an appalling 180 air crewmen, young men, often barely out of their teens, husbands, fathers, sons killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. Every single month, nearly 2,000 lives were consumed by the inferno above the Reich, and a significant percentage of those losses stemmed directly from bomber formations that, despite their heavy armament, simply couldn't effectively defend themselves against relentless fighter attacks. Their guns chattered, their bullets flew, but the enemy still came, seemingly impervious. The gunners themselves were performing their duties with courage and discipline. They were doing everything right according to their extensive, albeit flawed, training. They were tracking the target meticulously, maintaining a steady sight picture, and controlling their bursts to conserve precious ammunition. The problem, as was slowly and agonizingly realized, was not their courage, nor their commitment, nor even the quality of their equipment. The fundamental insidious problem was physics, and the cold, indifferent laws of physics, unfortunately, didn't care one whit about bravery or patriotism. Every gunner, from the greenest recruit to the most hardened veteran, instinctively aimed directly at what they could visibly see. It was a logical, deeply ingrained response. You point at the thing you want to hit. You pull the trigger. The thing gets hit. This logic, universally applicable and perfectly functional, works wonderfully when you're sighting a stationary target on a rifle range, or even when you're hunting a deer that's moving at a relatively sedate 20 miles per hour. But enemy fighters, these aerial predators of the Second World War, were not deer. They were not static. They were screaming across the gunner's field of view at speeds often exceeding 300 miles per hour. and some of the most advanced late-war models, such as the German Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, could achieve staggering velocities of up to 540 miles per hour, utterly rewriting the rules of aerial combat. At these mind-bending velocities, a critical factor came into play: the infinitesimal yet utterly decisive amount of time it took for a bullet to travel from the gun muzzle to the target's position. This meant that by the time the bullet, however fast, arrived at the point where the gunner had aimed, the target simply wasn't there anymore. The bullet itself moved with incredible speed, roughly 2,900 feet per second, as it left the barrel of a Browning M2. That sounds almost instantaneous, and at truly short ranges against slow or stationary targets, it effectively was. But in the dynamic, three-dimensional arena of aerial combat, short range typically meant 200 to 400 yards distances that allowed the physics of motion to become a ruthless executioner. The targets were not dawdling. They were tearing through the sky at speeds that would have seemed utterly impossible just 2 decades prior, in the nascent days of air warfare during World War I. Consider a Japanese Zero flying at 300 miles per hour. This seemingly impossible speed translates to the aircraft covering approximately 440 feet every single second. Now, let's do the math on a typical 300-yard shot, which is equivalent to 900 feet. At 2,900 feet per second, the bullet required roughly 0.31 seconds to cover that distance, a fraction of a second indeed. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But in those fleeting 0.31 seconds, that zero, with its blistering speed, moved an additional 136 feet forward. That's a staggering distance, roughly equivalent to 11 car lengths. The gunner, relying purely on his eyes and instinct, aimed precisely at where the aircraft was at the moment he fired. But by the time his bullet arrived at that exact point in space, the aircraft had moved on. Now, 136 feet ahead of its previous position, a full third of a second into the future, the bullet would pass harmlessly through empty air, while the enemy fighter continued its deadly work, utterly unscathed. This pervasive, deadly phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Military scientists and ballisticians understood this theoretical concept long before World War II. The principles of leading a moving target were, after all, fundamental to artillery, naval gunnery, and even sports like skeet shooting. But understanding something in a classroom, in the calm, controlled environment of theoretical physics, and solving it in the chaotic, high-stress, life-or-death crucible of combat were entirely different problems. The deflection, or lead, required was not some minor intuitive adjustment. It was massive, counterintuitive, and profoundly alien to human perception. Against a target crossing at a perfect 90-degree angle at a range of 300 yards, a gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. This meant putting your crosshairs on what visually appeared to be completely empty sky. It meant firing at nothing, trusting implicitly that the target would, by some unseen cosmic choreography, fly directly into your stream of bullets. Every human instinct, honed by millennia of hunting and projectile combat, screamed against this utterly illogical act. The visual cortex, the part of the brain responsible for sight, stubbornly insisted that the target was there, right where the eyes could see it. To aim elsewhere felt fundamentally wrong, a betrayal of basic marksmanship. Gunnery instructors, aware of the theoretical challenge, did try to teach deflection shooting during training. However, the results were dismal. The Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Laredo, Texas, for example, put students through rigorous programs starting in 1942. Trainees spent countless hours in turret simulators, painstakingly practicing leading techniques. They shot at towed targets from moving trucks, attempting to replicate the dynamism of aerial combat. They studied complex diagrams showing proper lead angles for various scenarios. Yet, tragically, very little of this theoretical knowledge effectively translated into the terrifying, chaotic reality of real combat. The fundamental problem was complexity. Deflection was not a single, simple calculation that could be memorized. It was a constantly shifting variable, dependent on a dizzying array of factors: the target's speed, its angle of approach, the exact range, the altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, and even whether the gunner's own aircraft was turning or flying straight. A B-17 ball turret gunner engaging a Messerschmitt Bf-109 making a frontal attack needed an entirely different deflection angle than the same gunner engaging the same aircraft during a beam attack from the side. And he had perhaps a mere 4 seconds to process all those variables, perform a complex mental calculation, and make the necessary adjustment, all while being shot at, while his aircraft bucked violently through flak damage, while his oxygen mask fogged up at 25,000 feet, and while fear coiled in his gut. The sheer cognitive load was paralyzing. The psychological barrier was just as deadly, if not more so, than the technical one. Gunners who, against all odds, survived their first few terrifying missions and bravely attempted to implement deflection shooting often abandoned it after apparent failures. They would aim ahead of a target, fire a burst of tracers, and then watch in disheartening frustration as their glowing bullets arced through empty sky in front of the enemy plane. Their immediate instinctive conclusion was that they had led too much. In the next engagement, they would instinctively reduce their lead, moving their aim point closer to the visible target. They were, in essence, self-correcting in precisely the wrong direction, trusting their deeply ingrained visual cues over the invisible, abstract physics that they simply couldn't perceive. Gun camera footage from 1943 missions repeatedly shows this tragic pattern. Initial bursts with some hopeful forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts, walking backward until the gunner was shooting directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current visible position. The casualties mounted and the toll became unbearable. 8th Air Force records from the brutal October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt, a critical German ball-bearing production center, painted a grim picture: 20% losses, with 60 bombers failing to return out of 291 dispatched. The surviving aircraft, limping back to their bases in England, often landed with dead and wounded crewmen, their hydraulic lines shredded, their engines trailing ominous plumes of smoke. In the debriefings, the returning gunners recounted the same agonizing frustration. Their guns had been working, they had been shooting, but their bullets simply hadn't been connecting. Something fundamental had to change, and it had to change fast because at the current, unsustainable loss rates, the Allied bombing campaign, the very spearhead of the strategic effort against Germany, would collapse before it ever reached Berlin. The very core of Allied air power was being undermined by a problem that seemed invisible, yet deadly. The solution, with a cruel twist of irony, had been sitting, largely forgotten, in a dusty filing cabinet since 1924. It was written by a man most combat air crews had never even heard of, Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. This was not the historical James Puckle, the 18th century inventor of an early crank-operated defense gun. This was an American artillery officer, a man with an exceptional gift for ballistics and a keen, forward-thinking mind. While serving as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School, Puckle had published a prescient technical paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. Puckle was no ivory tower academic disconnected from reality. He had served in France during World War I, witnessing firsthand the earliest clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat. Even then, in the era of biplanes and relatively slow speeds, he recognized with chilling clarity that the increasing velocities of aircraft were on the cusp of creating a targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship, honed over centuries of ground warfare, simply could not solve. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal, incontrovertible clarity. Puckle demonstrated that as aircraft speeds increased beyond a mere 150 miles per hour, the deflection angles required would swiftly exceed human intuitive capability. He meticulously calculated that against a target moving at 250 mph at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft length ahead of the visible target. His paper included exhaustive tables and charts, a wealth of data showing the precise lead required for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. For example, a 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300 mph target required a lead of a staggering 47 feet. The same target at 400 yards demanded a lead of 94 feet. The numbers were staggering, almost unbelievable, and Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing. Without mechanical assistance, he argued, aerial gunners would become effectively useless within a decade. The Army, with the short-sightedness that can sometimes plague even the most advanced organizations, filed his paper away and promptly forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation advanced at a breathtaking pace. Aircraft became faster, more powerful, and capable of higher altitudes. Yet, bewilderingly, gunnery training remained stubbornly rooted in World War I methodologies. Instructors continued to teach marksmanship fundamentals, sight picture, trigger control, breath control, as if their students were preparing for a rifle competition at a static range, rather than a frantic three-dimensional chase at 300 miles per hour and above. The few dissenting voices, those who advocated for advanced deflection training, were largely dismissed as alarmists. After all, the prevailing reasoning went, Americans had always been excellent marksmen. The legends of Daniel Boone, the frontier tradition of sharpshooting, the heroics of Sergeant York in the Great War, surely those innate skills would translate to aerial combat with proper practice. They didn't. When the United States was finally plunged into World War II in December 1941, the Army Air Force's gunnery training infrastructure was catastrophically unprepared for the brutal reality of modern air combat. The standard training program lasted a mere 4 weeks. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course, a paltry sum for combat proficiency. Most of that precious ammunition went toward stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves that moved at perhaps 150 mph in predictable, straight lines. Not a single training scenario adequately replicated the blinding chaos of a Focke-Wulf FW-190 diving through a bomber formation at 400 mph while executing a barrel roll. Graduates received their wings, climbed into bombers, flew to England or the Pacific, and tragically discovered that their training was essentially worthless the very first time a Zero or a Messerschmitt flashed across their gun sight. By mid-1942, desperate commanders, facing unsustainable losses in the grim reality of their poorly prepared gunners, started digging through old technical libraries, looking for anything that might offer a glimmer of hope. It was a captain named Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Section, who made a pivotal discovery. In the musty archives at Wright Field, he unearthed Puckle's obscure 1924 paper. Williams read it in one sitting, devouring every word, every calculation. He then immediately drafted a memo to his commanding officer, with 2 words underlined 3 times for emphasis. He knew. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster, this aerial slaughter, 18 years before the first B-17 ever flew a combat mission over Europe. His calculations were still devastatingly accurate. His warnings had been correct, and hundreds, if not thousands of American airmen had perished because nobody had listened. The question was no longer whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were, by now, indisputable, etched in blood across the skies. The burning question was whether anything could actually be done about it. Training gunners to consciously calculate complex deflection angles while simultaneously being shot at, while their very lives hung in the balance, seemed utterly impossible. The human brain, under such extreme duress, simply couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. But if conscious calculation wouldn't work, maybe something else would. The British, in their own moment of dire desperation during the summer of 1940, had already started finding answers. RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires out of Middle Wallop during the height of the Battle of Britain, faced a gunnery crisis that chillingly mirrored what American bombers would encounter 2 years later. Their pilots were undeniably brave. Their aircraft were magnificent machines of war. But they were missing. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas, reviewing gun camera footage from intense July engagements, discovered his squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt Bf-1009s was hovering around a meager 6%. 6 shots connecting out of every 100 fired. The Spitfire, though agile, carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire. Pilots were burning through their entire combat load, watching German fighters fly home untouched, ready to fight another day. In a moment of radical leadership, Squadron Leader Horace Darley, commanding 609 Squadron, made a decision that verged on insubordination. He grounded his entire unit for 3 precious days in early August 1940, right in the absolute thick of the Battle of Britain, when every single fighter was desperately needed in the air. He then conducted a series of live-fire experiments that directly violated every standard in the RAF training manual. Darley, a highly competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war, understood something profound about leading moving targets that the military theorists had utterly overlooked. The best shotgun shooters didn't consciously calculate lead. They felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously. Their hands moved the barrel ahead of the clay disc without conscious mathematical thought. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. His experiment was brutally simple, almost crude in its elegance. He had a Hurricane fighter tow a target banner, a long sleeve of fabric across the gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, where pilots aimed carefully, trying to calculate the precise lead angle, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded completely insane. Don't aim at all. Instead, he told them, watch the target's movement. Let your eyes track its path and start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The first attempts were, predictably, disasters. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet. Their bullets stitched patterns across empty sky, frustrating and demoralizing. But Darley was relentless. He made them repeat the exercise again and again. 40 passes each over 3 days. There were no lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles. Just repetition, 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 with one simple counterintuitive instruction: fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the 3rd day, something truly remarkable happened. The pilots' hit rates began climbing. Not dramatically, not instantly, but steadily. They went from a dismal 6% to maybe 12%. But that seemingly small doubling meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which, in the brutal arithmetic of air warfare, translated directly into twice as many kills or twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base, unable to fly the next mission. It was a lifeline. Darley meticulously documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation. The pilots who improved fastest weren't necessarily the ones with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They were the ones who could suppress their deeply ingrained instinct to aim carefully and instead trust their peripheral vision and motion sense. The conscious brain, Darley sagely argued, was simply too slow for modern air combat. The answer lay in training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, much the same way a baseball player's brain instinctively calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving complex trajectory equations. Fighter Command circulated Darley's groundbreaking findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically, desperate for any edge. Others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense, a dangerous abandonment of traditional discipline. The RAF's official training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to discard everything they knew about proper shooting. But combat results, in the end, didn't lie. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting consistently showed measurably better kill ratios through the brutal autumn of 1940. The data was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice, even if the official training manuals hadn't quite caught up yet. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's revolutionary methods, but the United States Army Air Forces faced a different, more complex problem. Fighter pilots, with their inherent maneuverability, could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition, using the very motion of their aircraft to generate lead. But bomber gunners couldn't. A Spitfire pilot controlled his entire aircraft, using its sweeping arcs and turns to create natural lead. A waist gunner in a B-17, however, stood in a relatively fixed position while his aircraft flew straight and level through flak, often unable to maneuver aggressively. He couldn't use aircraft movement to generate deflection. He had only his hands on the gun and his eyes on the target. If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion wasn't available, the solution had to be mechanical. Enter the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically the Radiation Laboratory's Division 7, established in early 1942. The name Radiation Laboratory was a deliberate and brilliant misdirection. It suggested atomic research, which effectively helped maintain the highest levels of secrecy around what Division 7 was actually building: cutting-edge fire control systems. The head of the division was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a brilliant 40-year-old engineer who had spent the previous decade developing sophisticated gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper, with his profound understanding of kinematics and motion, intuitively grasped that the deflection problem wasn't fundamentally about merely shooting, it was about prediction. A gun sight, to be truly effective in aerial combat, needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was in that fleeting instant, but precisely where the target would be when the bullets, after their brief but measurable flight time, finally arrived. This concept, simple in theory, was monumentally difficult to achieve in practice. The revolutionary Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by July 1943. It looked like something plucked straight from the pages of science fiction. A reflector sight, through which the gunner viewed his target, was connected to a complex gyroscopic system. This intricate assembly weighed a substantial 28 pounds and required a dedicated, robust electrical power supply from the aircraft's already strained generator system. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control. He would turn a finely calibrated dial, carefully matching a set of adjustable reference marks within the sight to the perceived wingspan of the enemy target. This action, remarkably, provided the sight with the critical range information it needed. Then, for approximately 2 crucial seconds, he would diligently track the target, keeping it centered within a small, illuminated tracking circle in the sight. During those 2 seconds, the internal gyroscope was working furiously, precisely measuring the target's angular velocity, essentially, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view. Here's where the Mark 14 became truly remarkable. Its internal mechanism housed a series of intricately machined cams and gears, essentially, an analog computer built from hardened metal that could solve the complex deflection equation in real time. It meticulously took the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity data from the gyroscope, and combined this with the known ballistic properties of the powerful .50 caliber round. Then, with astonishing speed and precision, it calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point to achieve an interception. It displayed this crucial result as a glowing, illuminated reticle that appeared to float magically in space, precisely ahead of the target. The gunner no longer aimed at the actual aircraft. He aimed at the glowing dot. And if he had ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, that glowing dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematical equations that would take a human brain several minutes using pencil and paper, and it solved those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating its calculations as the target's angle and range changed. Initial testing at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, during August 1943, produced results that seemed almost impossible to believe. Gunners who, just days before, had never achieved better than a dismal 5% hit rate against crossing targets, immediately saw their accuracy jump to 18% with the Mark 14. And this was on their very first day using the system, grappling with unfamiliar controls. After just a week of dedicated practice, those hit rates climbed above an astonishing 25%. This represented a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, a transformation of lethality that translated directly into 5-fold more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement. The Mark 14 was a game-changer, a technological marvel that promised to turn the tide for bomber crews. However, the grim realities of wartime production and logistics meant that manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of these complex Mark 14 sites across the vast Allied bomber fleet would take time the Allies simply didn't have. Production didn't begin in truly meaningful numbers until early 1944. Furthermore, installation priority was logically given to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines rather than attempting the monumental task of retrofitting existing bombers already fighting for their lives. This meant that the vast majority of gunners flying combat missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still tragically reliant on basic iron sights or crude reflector sights with no computing ability whatsoever. They desperately needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring complex electrical modifications to their battle-weary aircraft. They needed a technique that worked with the equipment they already had, right now. The breakthrough came, not from engineers or scientists in sterile laboratories, but from combat gunners themselves, men who faced death daily. Specifically, it emerged from the crucible of the Pacific theater, where engagement distances were often greater and visibility generally better than over the frequently cloud-covered skies of Europe. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a waist gunner aboard the aircraft carrier USS Lexington by March 1944, had already flown 31 combat missions, a remarkable achievement in itself, and had survived 4 terrifying aircraft losses. Fleming wasn't an officer, didn't have a college education, and likely couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it. But what he did have was invaluable combat experience. He'd fired approximately 4,000 rounds in combat and had personally witnessed confirmed hits on 7 enemy aircraft. And, crucially, he'd meticulously kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something extraordinary and profoundly practical, crude but insightful sketches of enemy aircraft. More importantly, these sketches featured hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses, vividly illustrating where he'd actually aimed during his successful engagements. He had intuitively measured these critical lead distances, not in abstract feet or yards, but by comparing them to the target aircraft's own familiar dimensions, 2 plane lengths ahead, or 3 plane lengths ahead. It was a simple, genius stroke of empirical observation. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to an officer during a routine debriefing session. The specific officer he presented it to is a point of minor historical debate, with some accounts mentioning Lieutenant Commander John S. Phillips or Ernest W. Woods, rather than the more famous Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, who, while a Medal of Honor recipient and top tactician, had tragically died in November 1943. Regardless of the exact identity of the officer, the impact was immediate. This was empirical deflection data gathered painstakingly under actual terrifying combat conditions. The officer, recognizing the desperate need and the potential of Fleming's pragmatic approach, immediately ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the air group. These were not classroom lectures or theoretical discussions. These were practical, hands-on exercises using a simple, repeatable technique that quickly became known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their combat positions while another crew member walked along the flight deck, holding a model aircraft on a long pole. As the model flew past at various angles and simulated ranges, Fleming coached the gunners to extend their aim forward by specific, easily visualized increments. 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, and 3 or more for steep, high-speed crossing shots. The key was giving gunners a concrete visual reference they could instantly remember and apply under immense pressure. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. Etre. The Lexington's gunnery officer, initially skeptical but desperate for anything that might work to reduce the horrifying losses, authorized controlled testing. He pulled ammunition expenditure and hit confirmation data for the previous 8 weeks, establishing a baseline. Then, he tracked the same critical metrics after Fleming's innovative training program. The results were undeniable. Prior to the training, the air group's gunners averaged 4.2 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 short weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed dramatically to 9.1 hits per 100. The technique, born of sheer necessity and empirical observation, had more than doubled their combat effectiveness. Word of this practical, life-saving method spread through the Pacific Fleet with remarkable speed. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught aboard other major carriers, including the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each carrier's gunnery officers added their own refinements and nuances, but the core principle remained the same: Give gunners a simple visual measurement system directly tied to the target's apparent size, thereby eliminating the impossible need for conscious, in-the-moment calculation. A gunner didn't need to know he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He just needed to remember 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot. The technique worked precisely because it matched how human visual processing actually functions. Our brains are exceptionally good at relative size comparison, estimating how many plane lengths something is. But they are notoriously terrible at absolute distance estimation. How far is 50 feet at 300 yards? Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no practical reference for what 50 feet looked like at that distance. But lead by 2 plane lengths gave him an immediate, tangible visual standard he could apply without conscious thought. The 0 he was tracking provided its own built-in measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement forward into what visually appeared to be empty space. The Army Air Forces, learning from the Navy's success, adopted similar training protocols by mid-1944, though they often referred to it as radius of action shooting or variations thereof. Technical manuals began to incorporate illustrations showing proper lead distances expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. The 8th Air Force Gunnery School at Lavenham, England, a crucial training ground, rebuilt its entire training program around the technique during June 1944. Mission loss rates, while still tragically significant, finally began to decline. July 1944, for example, showed 3.4% bomber losses per mission, a marked improvement compared to the devastating 5.2% from the previous October's Black Thursday raids. That seemingly small percentage difference represented hundreds of crew members who flew home instead of dying over Germany. However, knowing the technique and actually executing it under the unimaginable stress of combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the elegant simplicity of the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when the shooting started. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944 through countless interviews with returning gunners. The issue wasn't a lack of knowledge. Gunners could perfectly recite the proper lead distances and techniques during calm debriefings. The issue was that conscious knowledge and rational thought evaporated under extreme stress, replaced by a primal, deeply ingrained instinct that screamed, "Aim at the threat." Captain Harold Kleene, an Army psychologist stationed at Bovingdon, meticulously studied this response through detailed analysis of gun camera footage, carefully paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pervasive pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would often start an engagement using proper deflection, diligently applying their training. But as the enemy fighter closed in, becoming larger and more menacing, and as the perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward until they were instinctively shooting directly at or even behind the target's current position. Kleene's data showed this collapse happened fastest and most devastatingly during head-on attacks, where the closing speed between bomber and fighter often exceeded 500 meters, and the gunner had perhaps 2 agonizing seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under that extreme primal stress, rational technique dissolved into pure visceral reaction. Point at the scary thing, pull the trigger. The only true solution, it was determined, was repetition so extensive, so deeply ingrained, that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, becoming a reflex. The Army Air Forces ramped up its gunnery training programs to an unprecedented degree. Gunnery schools extended their courses from 4 weeks to 6, then 8, and finally 12 weeks. Ammunition allocations soared, allowing gunners to fire tens of thousands of rounds at increasingly complex, realistic moving targets. New, more dynamic ground-based training ranges were built, featuring moving silhouettes and arcade-style target practice that emphasized lead and tracking. Air-to-air target towing missions became commonplace, with gunners firing live ammunition at towed sleeves from actual bombers, sometimes flying hundreds of feet above the ground, simulating combat maneuvers. Crucially, the training environment itself was slowly made to approximate the chaos of combat without actual danger. Loud noises, flashing lights, and even simulated flak bursts were introduced into ground-based gunnery trainers, acclimatizing gunners to perform under sensory overload. Instructors no longer just lectured. They became coaches, yelling encouragement and correction, pushing gunners beyond their comfort zones. The focus shifted from mere accuracy to consistent, instinctive deflection. "Don't think, just shoot," became a common mantra, perhaps an oversimplification, but one designed to reprogram the gunner's reflexes. By late 1944 and into 1945, the combined effect of improved training, the gradual introduction of advanced computing sites like the Mark 14, especially in nose turrets and later models of the B-29 Superfortress, and the widespread adoption of the spot shooting method, began to significantly turn the tide. While hit rates never reached perfection, they climbed steadily. The sheer number of rounds expended per enemy kill began to decrease. More enemy fighters were observed to break off attacks, damaged and trailing smoke, rather than making unchallenged passes. The once staggering loss rates of 1943 began to become more manageable. The 8th Air Force in particular saw a noticeable improvement in its ability to defend itself. German fighter pilot accounts from late war engagements frequently noted the increased ferocity and accuracy of Allied bomber defenses. They reported flying through walls of lead and described bomber formations that were bristling with fire. This wasn't merely a testament to the quantity of guns, but to the newfound quality of the gunners operating them. The psychological advantage shifted. The hunters became the hunted with greater frequency. The story of the aerial gunner in World War II is a profound testament to human adaptability, the critical role of empirical data, and the relentless pursuit of solutions under unimaginable pressure. It illustrates how deeply ingrained human instincts, while vital for survival in many contexts, can become a deadly handicap in the face of rapidly advancing technology and physics. And it shows how, with enough ingenuity, scientific understanding, and sheer, bloody-minded determination, even the most counterintuitive problems can be overcome. The Eddie Kowalskis of 1942, frustrated and often doomed by an invisible enemy deflection error, gave way to the more lethal, more effective gunners of 1945, whose improved accuracy played a vital role in finally achieving air superiority and securing victory. Their struggle, initially one against the laws of physics, ultimately became a triumph of innovative training and adaptive thought, saving countless lives and fundamentally changing the nature of aerial combat forever.